Hello, my dear friends. Mike Amori from the WCA, 4 p.m. class. How is everyone? I know you've been really waiting for this video to come out to take a look at your work. Some of you even took time off from school. All right, here's the game between Fred and Grandmaster Ray. In the opening, we get a typical e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Fred has the white pieces, bishop c4, and the two knights defense. So if Fred wanted to, he could take this knight here, put it on g5, go for those attacks on f7, but Fred plays the quieter move here, pawn to d3. And then Ray plays bishop to e7, which is more than playable. And this actually is something of a mix between the Ruy Lopez and something called the Hungarian defense. What is the Hungarian defense? You remember these e4, e5, blah, blah, blah moves, right? So after bishop to c4, a lot of times black will just tuck the bishop in on e7, which looks a little bit passive, and then white will play for d4 right away, or c3, d4, etc. And if white plays d3, which they certainly can do, followed by knight f6, guess what? We have the same exact position from the game. So Ray decides to play with his bishop on e7, all good. Fred plays pawn to c3, designed to possibly push d4 someday, and also to keep this knight here away from d4. And I'm going to kind of push through the opening a little bit out without too much explanation, because as we study openings, my friends, there are so many variations and so many possible moves. It's really going to miss the point of this class, which is really to get everybody to understand concepts that repeat in games, not actual positions, because unless it's an opening book, those positions may never appear again. The concepts, however, constantly repeat themselves. So let's look at Fred's last move. After Ray plays d6, you see this pawn is now supporting the or securing the pawn on e5. So you'll see a lot of players tuck the bishop in on b3, which reveals another idea of c3. It opens the c2 square. And the reason for that is after d6, if white is not careful, it's possible for this knight to come here to a5 and trade itself for the bishop on c4. And you know, not everybody with the white pieces wants to give up the two bishops so quickly in a game. And the argument against that is, well, what's the big deal? Because if you tuck this bishop into c2, which is what happens in the game anyway, it looks like a horrible bishop. But Fred has a lot of experience playing this from the white side and knows that from c2, after a series of pawn breaks, this bishop can open up, including the pawn break f4, which would obviously come much later in the middle game. But if you can imagine this e-pawn getting provoked to take on f4, the e-pawn pushing for white, followed by a pawn push to d4, both of these bishops can gain enormous strength. Obviously, black's not going to sit back and just let that happen. All right, let's just go through a couple of moves. Castle, knight b to d2, bishop to g4, and Fred is comfortable leaving his king in the middle and just transferring his knight over to the king side. Ray plays pawn to d5, a typical break when the white king is still in the center. Sounds good, but again, Fred is aware of this break and knows to play queen to e2, avoiding a queen trade after pawn takes, pawn takes. You see what just happened here. So white is basically just laying back. And now the first move of the game that was a little bit strange was bishop to h5, not being provoked by this pawn move. So he plays bishop to h5, and then Fred just hits the bishop with knight to g3. Bishop goes to c2. And now I want to show you a little move here, or an order of moves. What can happen when you create a loose piece? Let's say I go after black's bishop with the move knight h4. The idea is very simple. I want the two bishops. I want to get rid of this beast over here on g6. You see how my knight is not protected, and it's sitting right on this diagonal here. Well, can black actually take that pawn? You can. And if the knight takes, the knight takes, the queen takes, these are all forced trades, and then bishop takes over here. And it turns out that white being down a pawn has what's known as dynamic compensation. And that's a term I'm going to put in the blog and bring up in class next week. You have to know what that means. Dynamic compensation is think of the movement of your pieces, the initiative that you gain from having a lot of activity. Note there's only one center pawn on the board with two bishops on one side. If there's only one center pawn left, that means the center is open. If the center is open or semi-open, there has to be some value from the bishops. And you can exploit that just playing bishop to d5, and now you're threatening to, chop up the black pawns here and playing down a pawn, but black having very bad structure, or actually just taking twice on the square. Although you should agree that white needs to be careful here because of the fact that they're not castled and they are undeveloped. But it's interesting stuff. If the knight moves away, you can recover your pawn back. The bishop gets attacked, and very, very interesting stuff. But here is the key. Let's go back to knight h4. It's loose. It's in the line of a battery. If this trade happens, try to visualize this in your head. If this trade happens and this pawn disappears, remember the white king needs to secure himself, but if that trade goes down, in return for the pawn, white will have the two bishops in a semi-open position. Is that pretty clear? So what's the main marker to remember? The loose piece and trying to understand what dynamic compensation means. Of course, if you're not sure, please come to class with some questions. I'd be happy to maybe have somebody else answer them for you. Okay, let's look at the conclusion of the game. So bishop to c2 is played. I don't know that Fred necessarily has to overprotect the pawn. Maybe he could leave the bishop on that diagonal for a while. But he chose to protect the pawn. And now queen c8. So what Ray's trying to do is get the f rook to the d file. And Fred here plays bishop to d2, rook to d8, and now the game heats up with queenside castling. Why would I say that? Of course, you have opposite side castling. As soon as that happens, Ray decides to strike with a5. So I did run these games on computers, but I'm not pointing out every single thing that the computer will see because it's, number one, it's not instructive for you. And number two, you're not going to find these moves in your games. So what you're going to do is you're going to depend on the concepts and then your ability to calculate within that concept. So just because you have two bishops in an open game, all right, that's a concept, that doesn't mean a thing if you cannot calculate, okay? So Fred pushes on the other side. So I love this game. The players are each following the standard procedure when the kings are on opposite sides. Get the pawns rolling, man. This is really good stuff. Another idea, which introduces another concept in chess, let's go back, is Grandmaster Fred could look at the move knight f5. And if you put that knight on f5, Gary Kasparov joked once, if I'm black and I can get a knight to f4, I'm going to win the game. And, it's sort of half a joke. I mean, this is a beast on f5. Black almost always reflexively takes that knight off the board. If you do, it introduces another concept that I like to call extending the bishop's diagonal. So if you take me, you'll see here that I've extended the light square diagonal one square, and this pawn comes into your camp. Okay, it's just an idea that you can put into place in your own games. So Fred plays h4, h6, and here I think Fred should have continued with the initiative, throwing that pawn deep into the camp. Just keep throwing it in and pushing the bishop all the way back, and then trying that same idea. Because now if you extend my diagonal and continue with a4 on the other side, I'm actually going to play g4. You see how the pawns keep pushing? And what benefit do I have by this? You really cannot take that pawn. You cannot take it because the d rook will come to g1, keeping the h rook on this line. And if you just choose to go back, you're going to get in a whole heap of trouble. You guys see that? Now, why am I bringing that up? Because after h6, rather than continuing to push, Fred broke a rule. Now, let's just say his move is the best move in the position. He played a4. What rule is he breaking? The rule is do not push pawns on the same side of your king when you're getting attacked. So theoretically, he's really supposed to be pushing the h-pawn and ignoring the a-pawn. But in his mind, he doesn't want this pawn pushing forward. Who's right? It's up to the players, not me. I'm just introducing the concepts. You guys calculate this stuff out. In comes the queen. Okay, so Fred played king b1, a very reflexive move, which is played so often when you castle queenside. But the question is, again, can we ignore queen e6? Because where is her penetration square? She's looking to come into a2. Okay, visualize her here. What can she do to you from this position? She can't take the pawn. She could check you, but then you can block with the bishop, and then she can take the pawn. It looks scary, but if you don't play king b1 and continue with h5, queen comes to a2, you just take the bishop. I mean, that bishop really has to move because this check on a1 is completely ineffective. You just block it, and if you lose the pawn, you take on f7, king takes, and there's our knight f5 move again. Not going to be pretty. So how do you see this stuff? This is a very, very important concept. You don't always see it. You have to feel it. And here's the deal. After queen e6, and I love Ray's move. I love the way both of these players are going at it here. You have to play king b1 in this position if you're white. If you feel that, right? If you feel I have to play king b1, try to understand that opposite side castling is a game of chicken. The game of chicken involves, I want you to quit before I quit. So you're telling me, hey man, get off my road. And I'm saying, you get off my road. The first one to quit loses. That's not always smart, but in chess, it's a very important concept. So Fred can say, you know what? You're pushing on this side of the board. King b1 is sort of a defensive move. I'm going to ignore it, and I'm going to push on this side. And then the concept becomes whoever wins these games is whoever gets there first. Okay, so he played king b1. Rook a to b8, a little slow. It's pretty clear what black is trying to do. And then bishop to d3. By the way, there could be a little queen exchange sacrifice here. Ray can go in for this, put his queen on b3. You can let that position sit on your board for a minute. But after bishop c4, which was played in the game, I'm sorry, let me get you to that position. So rook a to b8, bishop to d3, now knight a7. So these moves are a little bit slow. You see how the black rook is stuck behind the pawn. The knight goes to a7. And then here, after bishop to c4, you can just tell that the black pieces did not get enough, steamrolling, not enough power. After queen b6, the notation ends on knight e5. I think the class ended, but black is in a lot of trouble here because of the pressure that white has. This bishop, everything is just coming here. Okay, but the important moment to remember is after this move h6, how each player would continue. Okay, that was a well-played game. Let's jump ahead. This is a pawn structure from Rohan and Ashwin's game. White to play is in big trouble. Black to play, you just make a queen, correct? If I jump this pawn here to a5, you have a pass pawn, I have a pass pawn. So a5, c4, a4, c5, a3, c6, a2, c7, checkmate. If you spend one tempo getting your king out of trouble or off this line, that pawn's just going to queen. So with black to play, it's a very easy win. With white to play, you're going to have a similar problem because you can't just march your pawn up the board because the black king can get inside the square of that pawn to stop it. And then eventually you're going to have to deal with this outside pass pawn, giving black tremendous winning chances. Okay, let me explain to you or show you why I started with this structure. And to do that, I have to show you the game. Okay, so Rohan has the white pieces. He plays d4, d5. e3. He likes to play something called the Kali Zukertort, but we can put this under the Kali system or Cole system. I don't know how to pronounce these names. Colle. And the idea of playing an early e3, locking in this bishop, is, in Rohan's case, he's going to fianchetto it. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time on the opening. So they play a symmetrical position, knight f3. I love Ashwin's move, breaking the center, knowing that you probably don't want to put the knight on c6 before you get this pawn moving. b3, a nice fianchetto. Now knight c6, bishop to d3, and the first move that Ashwin played that had a little bit of a question mark was bishop d7. It's been played before. The question is, where is it going from there, and why not knight f6 first? But he played bishop to d7, and now a3. Whether that's necessary or not is up to Rohan, but why do you think he played a3? You can stop the video. He's trying to prevent knight to b4 so that you don't get this bishop, just like in the game with Fred and Ashwin. He doesn't want the light square bishop getting traded for this knight. So a3 prevents that idea. Development, queen to b6, which I like because it puts the queen on the same file as this loose bishop. So, there's always a chance for tactics. Bishop to e7. Now, if you play c4, then obviously you don't want to take this necessarily, so you can just tuck the bishop in on e2. Could have been playable. So instead, bishop to e7, now rook to b1, which takes away all of those tactics. And now castle, centralization of the knight, pawn takes, pawn takes. Now, you would think that you might want to take with the bishop to open the diagonal, but maybe you don't want to have white trade that thing off. Okay, the question here, however, is, does black win a pawn? Yeah, you're going to win a pawn here. The problem is, after you castle, and black does have a pawn, it's going to lead into a position that I'll show you in a moment, again revealing the concept of dynamic compensation. So I don't want to spend too much time on the moves here because there are so many possibilities. But after d4, securing the pawn with the knight hits the queen, knight, in between move because it attacks the white queen with check, knight takes, bishop attacks the queen, knight takes, pawn takes. And it's in this position, after the rook centralizes, that I want to start talking about the compensation. Ashwin pushed to c5, and now Rohan breaks up the structure. Here is a very, very, very important moment. After rook here to this square, Rohan plays the move bishop to a1. And his idea is he wants to get off of this file and see, he's setting a little bit of a trap that Ashwin kind of walked into. He wants to see if this pawn will take, but you see all the tension in the position. If you keep the pawns staring at each other, it's very uncomfortable. This is a critical moment in the game. If black brings in the last piece, now the ball is in white's court. What to do? What do I do? Do I take on this square, helping this bishop out? If I can keep a pawn on d4, this dark square bishop for white is going to be trapped for a long time. And you'll see that every single black piece has found a home. What happened in the game was, after bishop to a1, Ashwin immediately released the tension, missing Rohan's response. Bishop takes d4. Really cool move. Again, another situation where tactics and loose pieces come into play, and counting the number of center pawns. Count them. How many are left? Only one. Which team has the bishop pair? White. Is white down a pawn? They are. But where is the compensation? The two bishops centralized in an open game. I mean, this is really good stuff that you guys produced on Sunday. Can the queen take the bishop on d4? No, I think you know you can't. I don't know if you can hear the police car in the background. I think that's what you would hear if you took that bishop. If you take the bishop, obviously, bishop takes h7, you lose the queen. So the queen goes to a5. Rohan takes, pawn takes. Okay, you got this? Now, look at the pawn structure. It's the same structure I showed you guys at the beginning of the video. The only difference here, my friends, is all of the power pieces, or a lot of them, are still on the board. All the heavy pieces are there, queen and 2 rooks. So the idea of trying to turn this pawn into a queen is a very difficult thing to do. But this was an excellent example of what I mean by dynamic compensation. Do the math. White is down a pawn. However, what Rohan did was pretty cool. He activated his last piece, a5. Now, let's compare a couple of pawn moves here. Because the white pieces are so well placed, can white get away with a little pawn move on his own? You know, if you try to activate a rook, I'm just throwing in a move for black, and now you get hit with g5, you're in big trouble. Because if you move that knight, the tactics just start. You take a pawn, the king takes, queen takes. Stare at this position. Maybe do a little work at home. How did we get there? What did black just do? Pushed a pawn on the side of the board. Can white push a pawn on the side of the board? Yes. Why? They have 5 power pieces ready to support this push. Do you have to calculate to make sure your king doesn't get in trouble? Of course. But no worries. Rohan instead played a real cool sequence of moves to prove that this game is pretty much equal from a human standpoint. He attacks the queen, again offering the bishop for free. This time, if you take the bishop, you see the little tricks over here? Very good, Rohan. And Ashwin, the two of you, excellent game. Queen goes to b6. She gets attacked again. And that's the problem with having your queen exposed on an open board. Queen goes to c7. Rook b7. She gets attacked again. What happens if you take the bishop? Same trick. Really cool position. She goes to d6, and she's going to get attacked again with the same idea. It's at this point their class ended, and we had to move on. I just want to show you one more position from Vaibhav and Dennis real quick. Okay, here we have Dennis with white and Vaibhav with black. And here Vaibhav had just played that day. We had a couple of kids in the class who played a tournament, and they were brave enough to come to the WCA, which I love. I think it's really cool that you guys are into that much chess. It's really cool. So anyway, here Vaibhav played bishop to c5. So we have a little center fork trick if Dennis wants it, but Dennis didn't go for it. He played bishop to c4. We have some standard developing moves. Bishop to g4, h3, h5, and here at this point I just want to point out one little move here, that Dennis retreated his bishop to e2 to break the pin. I think you may have to let that pin sit and instead develop the pawn or push the pawn to d3 to get the light square bishop out. I know he was afraid of knight d4, but here I think you can afford the risk of playing g4. And of course, if the knight plays the in-between move check, you just take back with the queen. The bishop goes to g6. It's a chess game. You do have some weaknesses around your king. However, black is, needs to get developed, and it's a game. I think this was more than playable. So I just wanted to point that out. And I also forgot Chris and Navaneeth from a similar position, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. We have the Scotch game. So all of you with the black pieces, if you're an e4, e5 player, let me turn the board around. I didn't get the feeling that Navaneeth has something prepared for the Scotch. Let's go back a move. So we've seen this a gazillion times, right, my friends? So after d4, we have the Scotch game. The most natural move here is to take, and from here, as players with the black pieces, you need to be prepared for the Scotch gambit. and you also need to be prepared if if white just simply takes your pawn in the middle. This is the Scotch game. Very often when a player sees the Scotch game and they're not ready for it, they'll play pawn to d6, and here Chris just took, everything gets traded, including the queens. You can get away with this to a certain extent, but I would recommend to Navaneeth or anybody else who plays e4, e5 as black to look up the Scotch game, okay? All right, I'm going to close the video. That was a lot of work, but pay as much attention to what I wrote in the blog as to what you saw in this video. You played really, really well, okay? There'll be more of these before the term is over, okay, my friends?